Hello, everyone, and welcome to my introduction to this week's podcast of Listening to America. It's a couple of weeks before Christmas, but this is our annual Christmas show. You know, we used to, during the Jefferson Hour, talk about Jefferson and Christmas quite a bit, but Jefferson is sort of on the Scrooge end of the spectrum. He didn't observe Christmas. There was Christmas at Monticello, but it was nothing like what we regard as traditional today. Jefferson was a deist, after all, and he did not believe that it could be ascertained that Jesus was born on the 25th of December, and it wasn't the case that Jesus was crucified on the 25th of December. So for Jefferson, it's an arbitrary saint's day, and the Protestant Reformation swept most of that away, along with relics and much iconography in the churches of England. And as I think you know, Christmas was actually banned legally in some New England places during the 17th century. Things lightened up thereafter. At any rate, David Horton turns out is a sentimentalist and a traditionalist per Christmas. He doesn't have children himself, but he has nieces and nephews, and he takes that very seriously and has invented a number of his own rituals for that. I also talked to Nolan, our videographer, who you know the work of, but you haven't seen him much. I talked to him about the elf on the shelf phenomenon, which I had really, frankly, never heard about until now. And he has a pretty interesting and funny story to tell about his own family's getting on board with the elf on the shelf. I didn't say this on the show, but I do remember talking about this once with my old friend David Swenson. There's a book called The Physics of Christmas by Roger Highfield, and I don't remember much about it, but it's worth reading. And he talks about the red nose, for example, of the reindeer. Says that could have been some sort of a virus or bacteria. In other words, he goes through all of the things we think about per Christmas, and he shows that, there's a plausible background in actual physics for some of this, the aerodynamics of reindeer and so on. So if you're interested, you can read that. Roger Highfield, The Physics of Christmas. We'll post our favorite recipes for Christmas cookies. David talked about a brandy cookie with a maraschino cherry. That sounds good. My father's favorite Christmas cookie was a chocolate melt-away, and they are absolutely delicious. So we'll post those recipes. We're also posting a Thomas Nast engraving in which Santa Claus makes a visit to the Union Army during the Civil War. Much of what we think of Christmas and Thanksgiving emerges from that dark, cataclysmic period of American history. Perhaps like and perhaps unlike the one that we have entered into now. Both David and I talk about our favorite Christmases, and I do what I love to do most at Christmas, which is to read the Christmas chapter from Little House on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls Wilder. So Laura Ingalls Wilder is a kind of a fairy tale, it turns out, both in terms of the actual experience of the Ingalls family, but also because it tells a truth about life here, but it's a sanitized truth and not quite as grim as it actually seems to have been. My grandparents were sort of the last generation that really struggled, and one of my favorite Christmases that we talk about in the program is when we would go to the farm in Minnesota, and we would wait on Christmas morning for my grandparents to come in from milking their cows, and they were in no hurry because the cows were way more important than a couple of spoiled grandchildren wanting to open their Santa gifts. And so, but that led to my maybe most memorable of all childhood Christmases, that sitting looking out the window wondering when will they come up, when can we open them? And my grandfather, who was a very strong Germanic man, would torture us a little by maybe lingering just a little bit longer down with the steers and down cleaning up after the morning milking. So all beautiful and great, and I love Christmas, but not as much as Thanksgiving. And I like this Christmas show because I got to do some things that I really was eager to share with all of you, and I wish you all happy holidays, whether you are observers of Christmas or not. As David Horton says, this is the time of the year when the light gets at its least in the Northern Hemisphere, and then after the 21st of December, it slowly begins to come back. And so there's a pagan, deep ritual, fundamental to what it is to be a human in the Northern Hemisphere, that is behind the Christmas story. So let's go to the show. Thank you, everyone. There's still time to donate to Listening to America and to all the many enterprises that we're engaged in. And next year, remember, it's Lewis and Clark year, and I will do a little program on Lewis and Clark at Christmas because that's fascinating too. We'll see you soon. Happy holidays.
Good day, friends, and welcome to a special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm David Horton. I have the honor of being your guest host this week, all the way from Radford University in Radford, Virginia. And joining me today for a seasonal favorite is our great friend, Clay Jenkinson. Clay, how are you?
I'm great. I'm home after my long journey following John Steinbeck around the United States. You and I have been talking about that a couple of times. I got home just before Thanksgiving. I rushed back. In fact, I got within 200 miles of Radford, but I couldn't stop because I had guests coming for Thanksgiving. But we're going to still do that thing you want to do about the Radford world. But I got so close, I thought, oh, if I only had 2 more days. But then I went to New Orleans, and you're part of this story because my friend Liz Eagle has been browbeating me about gumbo. And as you know, when I was there last time, you took me for gumbo, and I loved it. And then I wrote about it, and Liz just beat the living daylights out of me. Said, whatever you had in Radford is not gumbo. Don't even think about it. Those people are frauds. If you want gumbo, it has to be New Orleans. So I made a special trip to New Orleans, and I did have some pretty amazing gumbo. So every year we try to do a holiday program, and we will talk about Mr. Jefferson, of course. But Jefferson is not exactly the most lively advocate of Christmas. He's not quite Scrooge. He's not quite the Grinch, but he's right in that part of the zone, I think.
I think it's interesting because, Christmas has evolved so much over the centuries, and Jefferson's Christmas would have been very different from the Christmas you and I have experienced here in the 20th and 21st centuries. But I'm curious, what are some of your favorite Christmas time memories and Christmas time activities?
Oh, man. My mother was a huge lover of Christmas. She's been gone now for 6 or 7 years. So of course we had a Christmas tree, but she had this big house in western North Dakota. So she had like 9 Christmas trees. One live, and the rest were of different types of, not artificial tree, but stylish things, and trees made of metal and different sizes and so on all over the house. My grandmother made spectacular Christmas ornaments and other craft work. And I now have all of that. And my father loved fruitcakes. My grandmother was a great fruitcake maker. I still make fruitcakes every year. It's like at the end of the gardening season when you have eggplant and no one will any longer take it. No one wants I give everyone in my world a fruitcake, and they look at me like, yeah, okay, next year just give me the gift certificate. So I do all that. There's a Christmas toffee recipe that my mother was very fond of, and I make, and my daughter just loves it, and so on. I'm not a big lover of Christmas myself because, well, here's my basic view. I want yours. Capitalism destroys almost everything it touches. And now Christmas is such a merch orgy. And I go to Walmart or Target or J.C. Penney's or whatever it is, and just about this time of year, and I see these people that are on a very tight budget trying to do layaway. And you can see how the strain of this, and then you see the Christmas wish trees. They break my heart every time, David, because there'll be some 9-year-old that says just like a coat and mittens, or I need a new pair of tennis shoes. And you realize how big a gap there is between the haves and the have-nots in this country. You realize how many people live very close to the edge of their capacity to pay for the things they want. And the strain of Christmas, because of course everyone wants their children to be thrilled on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, but it's not always possible for everybody. And so I just don't like that. I wish we could quiet Christmas down and make it closer to Thanksgiving. Every year my daughter and I, and when my mother was alive, would say, let's all agree to be really modest this Christmas. And then everyone just goes nuts anyway. And so there's something about it. Of course, another way to look at it would be like, is there any room for Jesus in this story? Because, of course, it's really just America's great shopping moment per annum. And I think it's true that 40% of all commerce in America occurs in December, between Thanksgiving and January 1st. And so all of that kind of leaves me with an unsettled feeling. What's your view of this?
Well, let me give you a couple of thoughts. I agree. It can be way too much about gifts and money and stress and checking off the list and all those things. You're 100% right that Christmas really does impact the overall season for most businesses. In fact, there was an article a number of years ago that said if we didn't have Christmas, our economy would have to invent something like Christmas because it wouldn't function otherwise.
You mean Festivus for the rest of us?
That's right. They call Black Friday because that's usually the day that a retailer goes from being behind to forward and being able to make enough money throughout that 4 or 6 week period or however long they tally it to try to make it the entire rest of the year. That many times stores and shops and even restaurants aren't terribly profitable the remaining portion of the year, and that one Christmas season makes a difference. But let me offer this thought. I agree completely, but too often, sometimes we miss the forest for the trees, that it's the experiences, it's all the wonderful little things that happen. And when you look back with that gauzy reflection of Christmases past, it was just as crazy 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Maybe it's been amped up a little more and the gifts are a little different. But you can see stories where people were so stressed out over shopping and so stressed out over bills, but it's really the memories of the Christmas ornament or the Christmas tree or the Christmas baked goods or the time spent with family, really that core essential moment. And I would say that's where Jesus comes in. But I think if people can step back a few inches and look at what really matters to their friends and family, to their children, it's the moments, it's the experiences, it's the opportunity to be together and to go through something that has a lot of magic and wonder and excitement.
Let me say this to you, my friend David Horton. Christmas is a time for family. There's no question. I mean, my sister's favorite song was "I'll Be Home for Christmas," and she and my mother would plink it out on our piano, and both of them would have tears running down their eyes when they did it. A child's love of getting up and rushing down to look under the tree. Of course, I mean, Christmas is really for children. I don't want to be Scroogey myself in any way, but I do agree with you about the light. So, the winter solstice is the 21st of December, typically. That's the shortest day of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, and it's the longest night. And so Christmas is a Christian saints holiday. We'll come back to that. That's why New England actually outlawed it for a time in the 17th century. It's also an echo of a pagan festival of light, that the sun has disappeared as much as it's going to. And now every day after the 21st of December, there's more light. And, I live in North Dakota. You live in balmy Virginia. The coldest days of the year are in January and February and early March. It can be 35 or 40 below with a 70-mile-an-hour wind. But I'm never too bothered by that, David, because every day there's a little more light, and I know the light's coming back. And I don't have SAD, seasonal affective disorder, but I know people who do, and I don't actually doubt that this is a thing. But I'll tell you this, at the other end of it, on June 21st, I get a little melancholy because I think now, every day now, for the rest of the year, there's going to be less light. I love those days in mid-June when I sit out on my deck and it's 10:45 p.m. and there's still a kind of a sunset feel, a glow in the west. So I think that one of the things that this holiday reminds us of is that we live on a planet that has seasons, and those seasons have an enormous influence on human behavior, human attitude, human happiness, and for some, human depression.
I love the variations of light that we have. Fortunately, our planet is tilted a little bit, which gives us the seasons. Otherwise, all days would be exactly the same length. All night would be exactly the same. There would be no seasonality.
It'd be L.A.
L.A., kind of.
Yeah,
but I will say one of my favorite things is all holidays have some cultural meaning, that they are a way that we share our values and our stories, the way we share our experiences, the way we mark time, and the way we focus on things. And it's fascinating to look at the different holidays around the world. Not just the way things are celebrated here in the United States, here in America, but to look at how the Feast of St. Nicholas is still such a major holiday in certain portions of Europe, Krampusnacht in Germany, and how all of those things come about to tell the stories of those people and their cultures. And I think it's fascinating because the Christmas we celebrate has a lot of America in it and a lot of Americanism in it. And one of the things I love about the days getting a little bit shorter is I think you tend to notice the sunsets and sunrises a little more that you wouldn't notice as much if the sun rises at 5 a.m. and sets at 9:30 p.m. And so it gives us a chance to experience that beauty of nature and those wonders in ways that we might not see if we just continued our regular days.
Oh, I know. And, when we used to go from western North Dakota to Fergus Falls, Minnesota for Christmas when I was a child, my father would try to travel at night on the hopes that his two children would fall asleep in the back seat, But then as you were leaving, like at 3 p.m, and it's kind of dusky at that time of year, you see a little ground blizzard, just a little drifting across the highway, and you see that yellow stripe, and there's snow, and the excitement of going to the farm, going to your grandparents. That was a wonderful part of growing up, that journey. And I think most people do wind up traveling on Christmas at some points in their lives. And I think that journey, and the children are saying, well, how will Santa Claus find us there? And that whole sense of expectation, I don't know at what point in your life that ended, but I can no longer remember the time when I could hardly sleep on Christmas Eve. We open our gifts on Christmas morning, and Santa comes overnight, so always Christmas morning. I remember it from my daughter, and she still fakes it. She still writes a letter every year to Santa Claus and puts out a snack, and then I have to eat part of the cookie. And for a long time, she said she believed, and maybe some part of her still does. But I remember when Christmas was magic for me, and I remember when Christmas was magic for her. And when you get to be an adult and you get, a vest, a book, all good things, but it's not the same as getting your first Tonka truck or your first Barbie doll.
Absolutely. I'll say this, it's a different kind of magic. And one of the things that we're blessed with as we get to become adults is we maybe get to make a little bit of the magic happen. So rather than the magic being so much something that someone else has produced in our lives, we get to experiment a little bit with that and be a magician and have part of that wonderful, wonderful Christmas joy. Time goes by fast when you're having fun, and it's time for us to take a short break. When we come back, let's talk more about Christmas. This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson.
Welcome back to this holiday edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. Across from me is my good friend, Mr. David Horton of Radford University in what I would call the west of Virginia. David, a couple of things here. Let's talk a little bit about Thomas Jefferson, since this program evolved from the old Jefferson Hour. Jefferson is not quite Scrooge, but he's in the same zone. He didn't celebrate Christmas. I mean, there were maybe a gift here and there, but it wasn't a gift exchange day the way it is for us, certainly not at our level. I doubt that he had a Christmas tree. He might have had a Yule log. But the fact is, most of the things we regard as Christmas traditions are 19th century creations. We can talk about how all that happened. Charles Dickens played a key role. So did Thomas Nast in this country. Jefferson often traveled on Christmas Day. He was a deist. He was a rationalist and a Unitarian. It's not that he wasn't a Christian. It's not quite clear what he was, but he wasn't a believer in the Trinity. And one of the things that the Reformation had done, especially the Calvinist Reformation, and to a certain degree even the Anglican Reformation, it swept away much of the Catholic tradition. Because the view then, as you know, was sola scriptura. If it's not in the Bible, we should not any longer observe it. And so the saints' days were swept away, and Christmas is the big saints' day. And so that one survived, but barely. Altars were destroyed, stained glass windows were shattered, terrible damage was done to art and to architecture. There's a sadness to all of that, even though one has to agree about if Scripture is your only guide, lots of what had happened between the death of Christ and, say, 1516 couldn't hold up under those conditions. And so our country was formed, in New England at least, by Puritans, and they were the radicals on this question. And it really is the case that in New England, Christmas was banished, was banned, was legally forbidden for a long period because it was regarded as superstition and idolatry, and worse for them, papism. It was regarded as Roman Catholic. And there was anti-Roman Catholic feeling in this country way into the 20th century. I mean, we all know that John Kennedy felt compelled in 1960 to give that speech in Houston in which he said, "I'm a Catholic, but my allegiance is to the U.S. Constitution, not to the Vatican or the Pope." And so it's hard for us to remember because we think Christmas has always been what it is, but it hasn't always been that way. So Jefferson as a deist, was not going to be drawn into the Christmas world. And now he might have been willing to observe it in a certain way because the Anglican Church observed it, but he was never going to be a Christmas enthusiast. And so when we look to him for Christmas traditions, he's often on the road, he's often writing letters, he's often working on his many, many, many projects. I don't think there was probably ever a time when they gathered under a tree, inside or out, at Monticello.
Well, I think it's interesting, too, as we talk about this history of Christmas and how Christmas during Jefferson's youth would have been very different from the Christmas that followed perhaps the 1820s to 1840s toward the end and after his life. One of the things that's so interesting to me about the holiday is the coming together of many, many different cultures. You're exactly right that so much of it had been connected to the Catholic Church, and there was the strictly religious portion of it. But then you had all these other traditions that were German and Dutch and from other parts of Europe that brought together different elements that would seem very strange. To put an evergreen tree in your home and put candles on it, that would seem like a strange thing to do if no one had ever done that in your neighborhood before. But I think it's fascinating that Jefferson, practical and very scientific, still would probably have felt, like you said, at least a little pressured to mark the holiday, to observe the tradition. And those kind of holidays are unifying for Americans and brought together many different cultures that found themselves here on the North American continent in the colonies and later the states. And during Jefferson's presidency, I'm sure that had elements that helped create the national culture of the United States.
Yes, and interestingly enough, in Jefferson's time, he would more likely have observed Boxing Day than Christmas. Boxing Day is the 26th. I lived in England for a number of years, and they are very big on Boxing Day in Great Britain. And it's the day when you gather up all the boxes and clean up after Christmas. But in Jefferson's time, it was bigger than that. That's the day that you gave gifts to your servants or your household staff or your retainers and so on. I don't think you gave gifts to enslaved people, but you take my point on how the British did it. And it also was kind of what we regard as Halloween, because there was a misrule. So the servants got the gifts, and the masters were sometimes played tricks upon. There were often servants would dress in the clothing of the genteel, and the genteel would have to take abuse in a playful way. So there was kind of a topsy-turvy quality to Boxing Day, and that was a bigger tradition in the world of England and Thomas Jefferson than Christmas, at least as we observe it today.
And then, it's fascinating that it moved to a more traditional version of Christmas throughout the 1830s and into the 1840s. And of course, Charles Dickens really documented that and pulled it together with his story, A Christmas Carol and Great Expectations, and the things that he saw that we give him a lot of credit for sort of creating, but really probably more documenting where the culture was with Christmas at the time.
Well, Victoria was queen. And Albert was her consort, and he was continental. And I've read that many of the things we regard as Christmassy, as Christmas tradition, were actually not invented by Victoria and Albert, but popularized. And if they had a tree, then everyone who could afford it would have a tree, and so on. So Dickens, I'm giving a talk later this week in a village up near Grand Forks, North Dakota. There'll be a lot of people there. I'm told I'm not going to portray Charles Dickens, but I'm going to dress up like Charles Dickens. And my friend of mine there, Kevin M., made this Dickens reading desk. Dickens gave these famous readings all over, and that was one of the biggest things. People fainted at them, and there was he was the Taylor Swift of his time. It was the hardest ticket to get. He gave them all over England, Scotland, Wales, but also in the United States. He came here twice, once in 1842 and once in 1867, and gave these readings. In fact, in Boston, at the Omni Hotel, there is a mirror that he used to rehearse when he was here, and they make a big deal out of it. And they have the door from his room in that now replaced, but still traditional hotel in the center of Boston. So I'm going to give that talk, and so I've been reading a lot about this, David, and he was not making much money at this point. He had many dependents, a growing family. He also had great charities. He was a very charitable man. And so he needed money. He was always desperate for money. So he then in 6 weeks writes A Christmas Carol out of kind of desperation. And there are traditions that say, the man who invented Christmas. There's a film about it from 2017. Mm-hmm. And so Dickens then kind of gives us Christmas. God bless us, everyone. And one of the most moving parts of it for me is the Cratchit family. Of course, Tiny Tim is dying. Turns out he doesn't in the end, but he's thought to be dying. And when they're planning their Christmas, they're dirt poor because Scrooge won't pay him. Barely lets him take the day off for Christmas. Bob Cratchit says to his family, all right, it's Goose again. It's good. Goose is good. But he says, maybe someday we can have a turkey. I had never heard that until I did this work, and it moves me to tears to think of poverty of that sort. At the end, after Scrooge has his nightmares and sees Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas yet to come, he then goes out and finds the largest turkey in London, still hanging, and has it sent over to the Cratchits with his regards. And so Dickens, of course, that's not my favorite Dickens piece. In fact, I'm not really even a fan of A Christmas Carol. I know that's heresy, but it's still a great piece, and it helps to invent Christmas. And you were saying that Thomas Nast also played a big role here.
Absolutely. Looking at the American version of Christmas and how holidays do unify us during the Civil War. Certainly, there were dark times and times where we needed something to be inspirational. And I'll share that President Lincoln, had actually instituted Thanksgiving as a national holiday for the first time in November. In 1863, in December, you had Thomas Nast, who published on the cover of Harper's Weekly, a well-known magazine, his very first interpretation of Santa Claus. And it was Santa Claus in the camp, where he is visiting a group of Union soldiers, and he's wearing a blue jacket with white stars and red striped pants. And he's certainly in the corner of the Union at that point in time. But that started a tradition that continued on, and really the American view of Santa Claus changed during that time. You had St. Nicholas, you had Santa Claus, you had all these different versions that had come to the country in different ways, but Nast popularized this version of Santa, and in a subsequent article that he had written and drawn, he pulled together some of those very traditions of Santa's North Pole workshop, of decorating a Christmas tree, of observing boys and girls to see who's been naughty and who's been nice, and to keep a list of everyone on the naughty or nice list. So it's really fascinating to see how certain individuals, 2 or 3, could have an impact in Europe and America and globally on this incredible holiday.
Amazing. So Thomas Nast, a very important figure in the creation of what we regard as the hoary old tradition of Christmas, that in this country will post that image of Santa Claus visiting the troops. And I'm so glad that he sided with the North. I'm sorry to you of Virginia, but so it goes, my friend. And Dickens doing his part in England.
Thomas Nast certainly evolved the holiday significantly during the course of his life, as did others. But the holiday is always continuing to evolve, even into the 20th century, 21st century. One of the most fascinating things that I don't know if you're familiar with at all is the elf on the shelf.
No. What? I mean, I just heard this my child is 30 years old. I have no grandchildren yet. I'm still in Cabbage Patch Dolls. I'm sorry. I'm stuck in some past. I'm still going to Walmart on Christmas Eve to find Luke Skywalker or Buzz Lightyear. So I've never heard, but I heard about it for the first time. What is this elf on a shelf?
Well, as Santa keeps a naughty and nice list, he needs some help. And there are these scout elves that people can purchase or can be gifted. And those elves move each night. They're situated in a location in the home. And then they move back to the North Pole to report on the child's activities during the day, good and bad, and then come back and find themselves in different predicaments. Originally, those elves just sort of appeared on the mantle or on the Christmas tree or maybe on the kitchen counter. Now it seems to be a tradition where the elves get into a little mischief or bring gifts or do various things and create a whole new cultural activity with Christmas.
Have you participated in this capitalist ritual?
I have, and actually it is part of making the magic, and it's a lot of fun.
Wow. So you know what I'm going to do here? My videographer is Nolan Johnson of Bismarck, and he's the one who told me earlier today about this elf on a shelf.
Yes.
Let's call him up and let's hear, because I think he has a pretty interesting story about how he is now participating in this. So let me dial up Nolan Johnson, shall I? So Nolan Johnson, you are my videographer. Everyone knows the work that you do both for Listening to America, all the video modules that we've been presenting over the last year, and you also edit the program every week. So I wanted to contact you because I was talking with David Horton, and he brought up Elf on a Shelf, and I hadn't heard about that till you told me about it, but it's new to you too.
It's brand new to me. It's something that my wife and I have been fighting for.
It's been around for a while?
A few years. Yeah, it's been around. It has to be 15 years.
Okay.
But we have an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, and their friends, our neighbors, great kids, both have elves on the shelf. And
so what is Elf on a Shelf first?
An elf on a shelf is a scout elf.
How big is this thing?
So it's as big as a Barbie.
So it's just a tiny thing.
It's a small,
looks like
soft doll
Okay.
in a red jumpsuit. There is a, one with earrings and a skirt, and one with a jumpsuit. And
no batteries required.
No batteries required. In fact, it's a bit like Toy Story.
Okay.
Where when adults or humans are in the room, the toys
they go inert.
Yeah.
So this is like a Ken or a Barbie doll, but it's soft.
Yep.
And once you have it, what happens?
So the elf shows up as a scout for
out of nowhere.
Santa Claus, out of nowhere.
Children have no idea where this came from.
They don't know where it came from, but it's here to monitor you.
This is going right to the North Pole.
And the elf itself, the making of the doll, they're kind of giving a side eye, like they are monitoring you. And so our daughters have been asking for one, wondering where our elf is for years.
And now you were pressured by neighbors.
We were pressured. We have, a couple of other 8-year-old girls in our neighborhood who have an elf. One has an elf named Bob, fine young gentleman.
You name it or they name it?
You name it. It comes with a book. The elf shows up with a book. So my 8-year-old's friend decided to give a note to her elf Bob to take back to Santa and says, "Hey, Bryce wants an elf. Is there any way you can dispatch an elf to this address?"
Wait a minute, Nolan. Is this like a neighborhood conspiracy? Did Bryce put them up to this, or is this out of the blue?
Bryce absolutely put them up to
so
it. More than one.
So she told them, write the note, and that worked.
It worked. She kept waking up. It was probably 3 or 4 days in a row, which doesn't show a whole lot of patience on
parental
my
backbone
part or my wife's part.
She broke you.
Yeah, but she was so disappointed. She woke up 3 days in a row. Daddy, I looked for my elf. Can you come help me look for the elf?
So now you're searching around.
And so we're looking in the tree, no elf. And then we even tried to play it off where my wife said, I think elves only go where they need to scout, and that's where
Since
naughty
you're such
kids
good little
live.
girls.
Yeah.
Oh, she tried that old trick.
Yeah, tried that one.
And then Lexi, your wife, contacted you.
Lexi, last night I was at the office, and I don't know what happened when they walked in the house. Bryce must have taken off looking for an elf again and really been disappointed. And I get a text that just says, "Will you swing by Walmart on the way home? The elves are in the back of the seasonal section." And I said, fine. But the thing about elves is some parents go nuts where they lay the elf out as if they'd just gotten through the whole entirety of the cookie jar, and they're laying in the middle of the island in your kitchen with crumbs.
Oh, so it's overeaten, and
it's a scene you got to set up every morning.
You can give as much to this as you want, but every single day there has to be a new scenario.
I think it's as far as you can take it. So when you get an elf, by the way, when I went to Walmart last night, there was one left.
You have to fight for it. I hope.
I kind of found it. Somebody must have hit it, so I'm sorry.
Oh man!
But I found it on a shelf where it wasn't supposed to be. And I grabbed it and I said, fine. I go, it's $35. Fine. It was worth it when I saw their faces this morning.
So you bring it home.
Yeah, I got it. So I get it home. You get it home, you take it out, you place it wherever you'd like to. It comes with a book, and my wife writes a note with her offhand to
she has to disguise her handwriting.
I told her to, just in case. Our 8-year-old is very smart. She could spot Lexi's handwriting, I'm sure. But we had her write a note. "Hi, I'm here. Bob, the elf, told me that you were looking for an elf. I look forward to telling Santa all about you." I come home and then it comes with a little storybook, like the tradition of the elf, and then you're supposed to name it.
Did they name it?
And so they named it. So we have a little girl elf, but the skirt is sold separately, and so they were confused by that, and I didn't notice that. And
skirts sold separately.
Right.
There's a whole bunch
she has
accoutrements.
She has little earrings. You can buy pets. You can buy elf pets.
So there's a whole line of stuff.
You can get a reindeer for your elf to ride on. You can have a little sleigh.
You're a solo elf at this point.
Yep.
That's it.
Solo
what did
elf,
they name
no
it?
pets, no whatever. They ended up settling on the name Zoe.
Fast forward to this morning.
This morning, the girls wake up. Best they've woken up on a school day, in my memory.
Crack of dawn.
Bryce comes running in. She sleeps downstairs. She comes running in. Mommy, Daddy, come see the elf. It's the fastest my 5-year-old has ever gotten out of bed. Sprinting out. They see the elf, and they're so happy. And Bryce reads the note. She reads the book. She immediately, is on the task of coming up for a name. And they were so happy. It was like a Christmas morning. And I'm sure this year, at least, it won't lose its luster.
Really interesting. I want to hear more about this down the road. So happy holidays to you and your family. One thing I got to warn you is one of you has to go make sure they're both actually asleep every night. Because Bryce could fake sleep and come to check this thing out. So they're spying on you too.
Right. I believe it.
See you in the new year. Wow. So, all right. David, I was unaware of this. I don't know that I'm really in favor of it, but I get it. His children were thrilled. It's a long way. We're recording this in early mid-December. It's a long number of days that elf has to keep moving around that house. But be that as it may, we need to take a break. When we come back, let's talk about your Christmas and mine. This is a special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson. Across from me, David Horton. We'll be back in just a moment.
Welcome back to Listening to America, a very special edition as we celebrate Christmas and the holidays. I'm here with Clay Jenkinson. I'm David Horton. I have the honor of serving as guest host this week. And as we talk about the Christmas season, I don't think any celebration could be complete without talking about the night before Christmas.
All through the house, not a stirring, not even a mouse. We've all heard it 1,000 times, right?
A wonderful poem, but, it is overused a little bit, and it is that old Christmas chestnut. I understand that you might have some other poems that you really enjoy that sort of celebrate different aspects of this holiday.
Well, there are tons of them, of course. Not all of them very good, but I always miss my mother at this time of year because my mother so loved Christmas. She'd bustle around making pies and give strict warnings about how many batches of cookies we could make beginning at 10 o'clock at night and so on. But she was a great grandmother to my daughter. They adored each other. And my daughter misses her so deeply now. But my mother loved cowboy poetry, of all things. She loved cowboy life. I was always a little on the skeptical side, but I love it well enough. We went to Elko to the annual cowboy poetry gathering, I think 15 times when I lived out in Reno. And there we met, like the king of cowboy poetry, a man named Waddie Mitchell. What a name. And he has a Christmas poem, which I sort of like. Would you like to hear it?
I would love to hear it. Would you share it with us?
The great Waddie Mitchell. I was going through my mom's junk drawer for something I needed bad, and I came across some sure enough treasures, things I didn't know she had. I found this faded paper that made me stop and pause. It was a letter from a 6-year-old to dear old Santa Claus. It started out regular, how he'd been good and such. The presents that he asked for did not amount to much, because what he really wanted, you see, more than a trinket or two, to get old Santy to let him be a real-life buckaroo. He said he didn't know too much, but he was quick to learn. Wouldn't matter where he throwed his bed or how much dough he'd earn. Just so he ride a horse and punch cows all his life. When he growed up big like that, he'd want a cowboy wife. Then it really struck me, when the kid had signed his name, that the author and the reader of this letter was the same. So I sat and wrote a thank you note to Santa for the gift he gave to a child back in '56 and the life he let me live. Waddie Mitchell. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, cowboy poetry is a little bit like country music in that it's kind of deliberately slightly corny, but that's the joy of it. And so Waddie Mitchell, if people don't know Waddie Mitchell's work, they should look him up. And there's a whole wide range of Christmas cowboy poetry. And if you are all listening and you want to go to Elko for the annual gathering, it is spectacular there.
It's so crazy how much our moms are part of these holidays, Christmas especially. And
you've had some Christmases under your belt. Don't talk about your kin. What were some of your best Christmases and why?
I think my best Christmases sort of blurred together into one amalgam of Christmas. And again, thinking of Mom, she passed away about 4 years ago. And She really made Christmas the holiday for us. Me and my sister. For 2 weeks leading up to Christmas, we didn't have an elf on the shelf, but we had a story every night. And we would gather around the Christmas tree and read the story every night. She hand stitched Christmas ornaments starting in July. She would make dozens of hand cross stitched Christmas ornaments that she would give to her friends and to family and to all of us. And those ornaments are still part of a treasure that when I pull them out, that I can see every loving little effort that she made in those. My best Christmas present, though, and this is a little bit different from what most people would probably say. One year I got a box that had a little drawing desk, paper, tinfoil, string, glue, magic markers, and it was my creativity box where I could make things because I loved, anytime I played with my toys, I would love to make my own toys. If I was playing with Star Wars figures, I'd make spaceships out of the containers that a food processor might have come in. And I remember that gift more than I remember just about anything else because it was the gift of imagination.
Did you open gifts on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day?
So we had some things we opened on Christmas Eve, and some things, certainly Santa didn't come till Christmas night, and so Christmas morning was for Santa gifts and for the other gifts. But there would always be something magical, a Christmas ornament or a special little story or something like that. And I started my own tradition with my nephews. I wasn't fortunate enough to have children, but I have two amazing nephews, and I ended up sharing this with the other family. On the night before Christmas, we would have a little gift and an activity and a story. And the first year, it was about 3 penguins who were lost and needed to find their way back home, but they ended up at the North Pole instead. So Santa put them in his sleigh, took him around the world, and ended up back down south. And we made penguins. We made little stuffed penguins as part of it and dressed them in clothes. And my nephews loved it. In fact, my one nephew, Matthew, would start asking me in October, what's Christmas Eve going to be? And so there was a lot of pressure to top last year. And we had misadventures. We had all kinds of stories and activities from steampunk snowflakes to ninja gnomes to sock monsters. There was a little bit of everything as part of it.
Is Christmas dinner turkey? Is it what's Christmas dinner in your world?
For years, it was ham, which makes sense. Virginia ham, certainly a big part of our lives. My grandfather's famous sharp mac and cheese that crusted over just a little bit on the top, and I could taste it still to this day. And my mom made famous brandy cookies with maraschino cherries, and I can still, just the sight of a maraschino cherry reminds me of that cookie to this very day.
My favorite Christmas cookie was my father's favorite, which is something called chocolate meltaways. So if you will send me the recipe for the cherry brandy, I'll put up the recipe for the chocolate meltaways, and people can do that if they please.
Clay, tell me a little bit more about some of your favorite Christmases.
Well, I've been thinking about this because you and I have been talking about this program for a few weeks, and it's it's hard. It makes me very nostalgic and even a little weepy at times. When I was a child, we used to go to the farm in Fergus Falls. My grandparents had a small dairy, 16 head, and on Christmas morning, and my grandfather was a wonderfully gruff guy, thought we were spoiled and we were urban kids, he didn't understand the true meaning of anything. And so on Christmas morning, we'd get up, as soon as our parents would let us, and we'd go into the kitchen, which was where everything happened in the farm. We'd be waiting for Grandpa to come up from milking. And at some point, he is torturing us, and we're just beside ourselves. And then we run in, and I got Huckleberry Hound, and my sister got Deputy Dog that Christmas, and we were in hog heaven. But the waiting, the stalling was what made it so great. So that was a whole phase. And then they had to come to Western North Dakota for Christmas, and that was different. So this would have been, 1967 or 1969 probably, somewhere in there. My parents gave me a 35 millimeter camera for Christmas. I had wanted one, and they gave me this camera. It was a Canon Sure Shot and 2 rolls of color film. And it was like maybe the best and most important gift I ever received, because I went out that morning. I still have the 2 first photographs I took of our house at Christmas. But then I became a photographer. And that gift had such influence on everything that has followed. I doubt that we would be talking right now if it hadn't been for that gift on that occasion. So those are 2 gifts. But there's another thing that I guess I want to maybe close the program by sharing, if it's okay with you. I think we both agree that the books of Laura Ingalls Wilder are important, especially to young people. I remember when my daughter was 3 or 4 years old, or about then, that I reread Little House on the Prairie, and I discovered again The Christmas Story. And it is my all-time favorite Christmas story, and for every year since then, I have read it to her at Christmas. If you and our listeners would indulge me, I'd like to close our Christmas program by saying happy holidays to all of you, those who observe Christmas and those who don't. So thankful for the people who enjoy what we do. I'm thankful to you, my friend David Horton. And now, with your permission, I would like to close this year's program with the story from Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie. Mr. Edwards meets Santa Claus. The days were short and cold, and the wind whistled sharply, but there was no snow. Cold rains were falling. Day after day, the rain fell, pattering on the roof and pouring from the eaves. Mary and Laura stayed close by the fire, sewing their 9-patch quilt blocks, cutting paper dolls from scraps of wrapping paper, and hearing the wet sound of the rain. Every night was so cold that they expected to see snow next morning, but in the morning they only saw sad, wet grass. They pressed their noses against the squares of glass in the windows that Pa had made, and they were glad they could see out, but they wished they could see snow. Laura was anxious because Christmas was near, and Santa Claus and his reindeer could not travel without snow. Mary was afraid that even if it snowed, Santa Claus could not find them so far away in Indian territory. When they asked Ma about this, she said she didn't know. What day is it? They asked her anxiously. How many more days till Christmas? And they counted off the days on their fingers till there was only one more day left. Rain was still falling that morning. There was not one crack in the gray sky. They felt almost sure there would be no Christmas. Still, they kept hoping. Just before noon, the light changed. The clouds broke and drifted apart, shining white in the clear blue sky. The sun shone, birds sang, and thousands of drops of water sparkled on the grasses. But when Ma opened the door to let in the fresh, cold air, they heard the creek roaring. They had not thought about the creek. Now they knew they would have no Christmas because Santa Claus could not cross that roaring creek. Pa came in, bringing a big, fat turkey. If it weighed less than 20 pounds, he said he'd eat it, feathers and all. He asked Laura, "How's that for a Christmas dinner? Think you can manage one of those drumsticks?" She said yes, she could, but she was sober. Then Mary asked him if the creek was going down, and he said it was still rising. Ma said it was too bad. She hated to think of Mr. Edwards eating his bachelor cooking all alone on Christmas Day. Mr. Edwards had been asked to eat Christmas dinner with them, but Pa shook his head and said a man would risk his neck trying to cross the creek now. No, he said, that current's too strong. We'll just have to make up our minds that Edwards won't be here tomorrow. Of course, that meant that Santa Claus could not come either. Laura and Mary tried not to mind too much. They watched Ma dress the wild turkey, and it was a very fat turkey. They were lucky little girls to have a good house to live in and a warm fire to sit by, and such a turkey for their Christmas dinner. Ma said so. And it was true. Ma said it was too bad that Santa Claus couldn't come this year, but they were such good girls that he hadn't forgotten them. He would surely come next year. Still, they were not happy. After supper that night, they washed their hands and faces, buttoned their red flannel nightgowns, tied their nightcap strings, and soberly said their prayers. They lay down in bed and pulled the covers up. It did not seem at all like Christmas time. Pa and Ma sat silent by the fire. After a while, Ma asked why Pa didn't play the fiddle, and he said, "I don't seem to have the heart to, Caroline." After a longer while, Ma suddenly stood up. "I'm going to hang up your stockings, girls," she said. "Maybe something will happen." Laura's heart jumped, but then she thought again of the creek, and she knew nothing could happen. Ma took one of Mary's clean stockings and one of Laura's, and she hung them from the mantel shelf on either side of the fireplace. Laura and Mary watched her over the edge of their bed covers. "Now go to sleep," Ma said, kissing them good night. "Morning will come quicker if you're asleep." She sat down again by the fire, and Laura almost went to sleep. She woke up a little when she heard Pa say, "You've only made it worse, Caroline." And she thought she heard Ma say, "No, Charles, there's the white sugar," but perhaps she was dreaming. Then she heard Jack growl savagely. The door latch rattled, and someone said, "Ingalls! Ingalls!" Pa was starting up the fire, and when he opened the door, Laura saw that it was morning. The outdoors was gray. "Great fishhooks, Edwards! Come in, man! What happened?" Pa exclaimed. Laura saw the stockings limply dangling, and she scrooged her shut eyes into the pillow. She heard Pa piling wood on the fire, and she heard Mr. Edwards say he had carried his clothes on his head when he swam the creek. His teeth rattled and his voice shivered. He'd be all right, he said, as soon as he got warm. "It was too big a risk, Edwards," Pa said. "We're glad you're here, but that was too big a risk for a Christmas dinner." "Your little ones had to have Christmas," Mr. Edwards replied. "No creek could stop me after I fetched them their gifts from Independence." Laura sat straight up in bed. "Did you see Santa Claus?" she shouted. "I sure did," Edwards said. "Where? When? What did he look like? What did he say? Did he really give you something for us?" Mary and Laura cried together. Wait a minute," Mr. Edwards laughed. And Ma said she would put the presents in the stockings as Santa Claus intended. She said they mustn't look. Mr. Edwards came and sat on the floor by their bed, and he answered every question they asked him. They honestly tried not to look at Ma, and they didn't quite see what she was doing. When he saw the creek rising, Mr. Edwards said he had known that Santa Claus could not get across it. But you crossed it," Laura said. "Yes," Mr. Edwards replied, "but Santa Claus is too old and fat. He couldn't make it, or a long, lean razorback like me could do so." And Mr. Edwards reasoned that if Santa Claus couldn't cross the creek, likely he would come no farther south than Independence. Independence. Why should he come 40 miles across the prairie only to be turned back? Of course he wouldn't do that. So Mr. Edwards had walked to Independence. In the rain, Mary asked. Mr. Edwards said he wore his rubber coat. And there, coming down the street in Independence, he had met Santa Claus. In the daytime? Laura asked. She hadn't thought that anyone could see Santa Claus in the daytime. No, Mr. Edwards said it was night, but the light shone out across the street from the saloons. Well, the first thing Santa Claus said was, "Hello, Edwards. Did he know you?" Mary asked. And Laura asked, "How did you know he was really Santa Claus?" Mr. Edwards said that Santa Claus knew everybody, and he had recognized Santa at once by his whiskers. Santa Claus had the longest, thickest, whitest set of whiskers west of the Mississippi. So Santa Claus said, "Hello, Edwards. Last time I saw you, you were sleeping on a corn shuck bed in Tennessee." And Mr. Edwards well remembered the little pair of red yarn mittens that Santa Claus had left him that time. Then Santa Claus said, "I understand you're living now down along the Verdigris River. Have you ever met up down yonder with two little young girls named Mary and Laura?" "I surely am acquainted with them," Mr. Edwards replied. "Rest pretty heavy on my mind," said Santa Claus. "They are both of them sweet, pretty, good little young things, and I know they are expecting me. I surely do hate to disappoint two good little girls like them. Yet with the water up the way it is, I can't ever make it across that creek. I can figure no way whatsoever to get to their cabin this year, Edwards. Would you do me the favor to fetch them little girls their gifts this one time?" "I'll do that with pleasure," Mr. Edwards told him. Then Santa Claus and Mr. Edwards stepped across the street to the hitching posts where the pack mule was tied. "Didn't he have his reindeer?" Laura asked. "You know he couldn't," Mary said. "There isn't any snow." "Exactly," said Mr. Edwards. Santa Claus traveled with a pack mule in the Southwest, and Santa Claus unhitched the pack and looked through it and took out the presents for Mary and Laura. "Oh, what are they?" Laura cried, but Mary asked, "Then what did he do?" "Then he shook hands with Mr. Edwards, and he swung up on his fine bay horse. Santa Claus rode well for a man of his weight and build, and he tucked his long white whiskers under his bandana. 'So long, Edwards,' he said, and he rode away on the Fort Dodge trail, leading his pack mule and whistling." Laura and Mary were silent an instant, thinking of that. Then Ma said, "You may look now, girls." Something was shining bright in the top of Laura's stocking. She squealed and jumped out of bed. So did Mary, but Laura beat her to the fireplace, and the shining thing was a glittering new tin cup. Mary had one exactly like it. These new tin cups were their very own. Now they each had a cup to drink out of. Laura jumped up and down and shouted and laughed, but Mary stood still and looked with shining eyes at her own tin cup. Then they plunged their hands into the stockings again. They pulled out two long, long sticks of candy. It was peppermint candy, striped red and white. They looked and looked at that beautiful candy, and Laura licked her stick just one lick. But Mary was not so greedy. She didn't even take one lick of her stick. Those stockings weren't empty yet. Mary and Laura pulled out two small packages. They unwrapped them, and each found a little heart-shaped cake. Over their delicate brown tops was sprinkled white sugar. The sparkling grains lay like tiny drifts of snow. The cakes were too pretty to eat. Mary and Laura just looked at them. But at last Laura turned hers over, and she nibbled a tiny nibble from underneath where it wouldn't show. And the inside of that little cake was white. It had been made of pure white flour, sweetened with white sugar. Laura and Mary never would have looked into their stockings again. The cups and the cakes and the candy were almost too much. They were too happy to speak. Ma asked if they were sure the stockings were empty. Then they put their arms down inside them just to make sure, and in the very toe of each stocking was a shining bright new penny. They had never even thought of such a thing as having a penny. Think of having a whole penny for your very own. Think of having a cup and a cake and a stick of candy and a penny. There had never been such a Christmas. Now, of course, right away, Laura and Mary should have thanked Mr. Edwards for bringing those lovely presents all the way from Independence, but they had forgotten all about Mr. Edwards. They had even forgotten Santa Claus. In a minute, they would have remembered, but before they did, Ma said gently, "Aren't you going to thank Mr. Edwards?" "Oh, thank you, Edwards, thank you," they said, and they meant it with all their hearts. Pa shook Mr. Edwards' hand too, and shook it again. Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards acted as if they were almost crying. Laura didn't know why, so she gazed again at her beautiful presents. She looked up again when Ma gasped, and Mr. Edwards was taking sweet potatoes out of his pockets. He said they had helped to balance the package on his head when he swam across the creek. He thought Pa and Ma might like them with their Christmas turkey. There were 9 sweet potatoes. Mr. Edwards had brought them all the way from town, too. It was just too much, Pa said. "It's too much, Edwards." They never could thank him enough. Mary and Laura were too excited to eat breakfast. They drank the milk from their shining new cups, but they could not swallow the rabbit stew and the cornmeal mush. "Don't make them, Charles," Ma said. "It will be dinner time soon." For Christmas dinner, there was a tender, juicy roasted turkey. And there were the sweet potatoes, baked in the ashes and carefully wiped so that you could eat the good skins, too. There was a loaf of salt-rising bread made from the last of the white flour. And after all that, there were stewed dried blackberries and little cakes. But these little cakes were made with brown sugar, and they did not have white sugar sprinkled over their tops. Then Pa and Ma and Mr. Edwards sat by the fire and talked about Christmas times back in Tennessee and up north in the big woods. But Mary and Laura looked at their beautiful cakes and played with their pennies and drank water out of their new cups. And little by little, they licked and sucked their sticks of candy till each stick was sharp-pointed on one end. That was a happy Christmas.
Well, I hope everyone ends up with an orange in their stocking this year and that they have a magical holiday season no matter what they celebrate. I hope your Christmas is incredible. And Clay, I want to thank you for all that you do for all of us, the people who get to be a part of your world and to listen to the program and to think and to explore and to live vicariously through your journeys, both on the air and around the country.
Well, just two things, David. First of all, bless you, and in my Santa list, I'm hoping for a robotic elf on the shelf. Maybe someday you'll be able to supply that. But also, can we meet again next week? I'd like to have us do the New Year's program because I have some very special thoughts about New Year's 2025.
I would love to.
All right, we'll see you all then next week for another important edition of Listening to America.